On September 2nd, 31st BC, in a narrow strait off the western coast of Greece, the future of the Roman world was decided in less than 3 hours. Not by legions on land, not by the clash of gladi in the dust of some distant plain, but on water, by 19 small, swift warships that few people had ever heard of before that morning. These were the Liburnians, light vessels originally built by the pirate tribes of Illyria, and in the hands of Marcus Agrippa they became the instrument that ended the Roman Republic forever. Picture the scene. 2 fleets, each representing a different vision of Rome, drifting into position under a late summer sun. On one side, the combined armada of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII. More than 230 warships, many of them towering quinqueremes and massive 8s, 9s, and even 10s, ships so large they carried siege towers and hundreds of marines. Their sails were dyed purple, their prows gilded. To the crowds watching from the hills, this looked like invincible might. On the other side stood the fleet of Caesar Octavian, the 32-year-old heir of Julius Caesar. Fewer ships, only about 250, but radically different in design. Octavian had no interest in matching Antony's giants. Instead, his admiral Marcus Agrippa had spent 2 years preparing a revolutionary force built around speed, agility, and a deadly new tactic. At the heart of that force were the Liburnians, sleek, low-slung berems with bronze-sheathed rams, crewed by 170 rowers and a handful of archers. They were half the size of Antony's flagships, drew half the water, and could turn in their own length. The roots of this confrontation stretched back 14 years, to the blood-soaked Ides of March 44th BC. When Julius Caesar fell beneath the daggers, he left no legitimate son, only an 18-year-old grandnephew named Gaius Octavius, whom he adopted in his will. Overnight, the teenage Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and Rome's most powerful men scrambled to control him. Instead, he controlled them. Within months, he had raised an army, marched on Rome, and forced the Senate to name him consul at the age of 19. Mark Antony, Caesar's greatest general, at first allied with the boy against the liberators Brutus and Cassius. Together with Marcus Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship that carved the Roman world into 3 pieces. But alliance turned to rivalry. Antony took the wealthy east and in 41 BC summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus. What began as politics became passion. He married her in an Egyptian ceremony, fathered children with her, and began handing Roman provinces to those children. To many Romans, this was treason wrapped in scandal. By 33 BC, the triumvirate had collapsed. Lepidus was sidelined, Antony was openly calling himself the new Dionysus alongside Cleopatra's Isis, and Octavian, cold, methodical, and brilliant at propaganda, was painting them as foreign tyrants who would drag Rome into Eastern despotism. In Rome, Octavian read Antony's will aloud in the Senate. It confirmed donations of Roman territory to Cleopatra's children and requested burial in Alexandria. The city exploded in rage. War was inevitable. Octavian needed a navy, and he needed it fast. Antony controlled most of the Republic's fleets, but Agrippa, his childhood friend and greatest commander, had spent years campaigning in the Adriatic against Illyrian pirates. There he had encountered the Liburnian ships, fast raiders that struck and vanished before heavier Roman quinqueremes could react. Agrippa saw genius in their design. He ordered hundreds built in Italian shipyards, refining them with stronger timbers, heavier bronze rams, and a new weapon. The harpax, a grappling hook fired by a catapult that could reel an enemy ship in like a fish. By the spring of 31 BC, both fleets were converging on the Ambracian Gulf in western Greece. Antony established his base at Actium, a promontory guarding a large lagoon. His plan was simple: wait for Octavian to attack, then use his bigger ships to overwhelm the smaller enemy in close combat. But Agrippa refused to play that game. For months he raided Antony's supply lines, captured key ports, Methone, Corinth, the island of Leucas, and slowly starved Antony's enormous army and fleet. Desertions mounted. Morale collapsed. Cleopatra, watching her treasure dwindle, urged Antony to fight at sea and then sail for Egypt. On the morning of September 2nd, Antony had perhaps 170 warships left fit to fight. He formed them in a tight line across the mouth of the gulf, hoping to lure Octavian into the narrows where his heavy ships could grapple and board. Octavian declined the invitation. Agrippa anchored his fleet in open water 4 miles out and waited. The wind was rising from the northwest, the perfect breeze for the Liburnians. Around noon, Antony's fleet began to advance. As they did, Agrippa executed the maneuver that would win the battle. He ordered his left wing, commanded by himself, to extend seaward, outflanking Antony's right. At the same time, the center and right held back, opening a fatal gap in the enemy formation. Antony's heavy ships, slow and lumbering, could not close the distance quickly enough. Into that gap poured squadron after squadron of Liburnians, 19 of them in the decisive moment, racing at 9 knots, oars flashing, rams hungry for timber. These were not the graceful triremes of storybooks. Liburnians were hunters, killers built for one purpose: to strike the flank or stern of a larger ship at full speed and rip its hull open below the waterline. Their bronze rams weighed nearly a ton each, cast in the shape of a trident, designed not to pierce but to tear. When 19 of them hit Antony's line almost simultaneously, the effect was catastrophic. The first great victim was Antony's flagship, a monstrous 10 that carried Cleopatra's royal standard nearby. A Liburnian under the command of Agrippa's personal squadron captain slammed into its starboard quarter at ramming speed. The impact sounded like a thunderclap across the water. Oars splintered into kindling, the entire starboard oar bank sheared away, and the huge ship slewed helplessly sideways, exposing its vulnerable stern to 2 more Liburnians that followed in perfect sequence. Within minutes, the flagship was taking water through a gaping hole 10 feet wide. All along the line, the same story repeated itself. Antony's captains had trained for traditional dissects, rushing through gaps to rake enemy oars, but Agrippa had turned the tactic against them. His Liburnians did not try to break through. They attacked from the outside in, using their superior speed to keep the range open, darting in only to ram and withdraw before the heavier ships could turn. When Antony's ships tried to close, they found themselves facing a storm of harpax hooks. Fired from ballistae mounted on the Liburnians' reinforced foredecks, the iron-clawed grapples buried themselves in rigging and hulls, then winched the victim irresistibly toward waiting rams and boarding parties. In the center, Mark Antony fought from the deck of his secondary flagship, shouting orders that were lost in the chaos. He watched ship after ship of his proud fleet crippled or burning. Then, at the height of the disaster, something happened that would be debated for centuries. Around the 3rd hour of battle, the wind freshened dramatically. The same northwest breeze Agrippa had waited for all morning. 60 of Cleopatra's squadron, stationed in reserve behind the main line and carrying the royal treasure fleet, suddenly hoisted sail and made for the open sea. Roman sources would later claim betrayal, that Cleopatra panicked and fled, dragging Antony after her. Modern historians argue it may have been a prearranged signal. If the battle turned hopeless, the queen would preserve the treasury and the dynasty. Whatever the truth, when Antony saw the purple sails of the Egyptian squadron racing south, he abandoned everything. Transferring his flag to a fast Liburnian of his own, heavy irony, he pursued her with just a handful of ships. Behind him, his fleet disintegrated. With their commander gone, morale in Antony's remaining ships collapsed. Some captains tried to surrender by lowering their oars. Agrippa's crews ignored them and kept ramming. Others struck their colors and were spared, only to be burned later when fire arrows turned the drifting hulks into floating pyres. By late afternoon, the sea was littered with wreckage, broken rams, purple sailcloth, bodies in scaled armor floating face down among the splinters. Octavian himself watched from the deck of a Liburnian far to the rear. He was no sailor and suffered terribly from seasickness, but Agrippa sent him a simple message by signal flag. The day is ours. Only 19 of Antony's great warships escaped, with Cleopatra. The rest, over 150, were captured or destroyed. 5,000 of his men died in the water. Thousands more were taken prisoner. Octavian lost fewer than a dozen ships and perhaps a few hundred sailors. The battle lasted barely 3 hours from first ram to final surrender. In that brief span, The Roman Republic died. The dream of a restored oligarchy, of a Rome governed by senate and magistrates rather than one man, sank beneath the blood-stained waves of the Ionian Sea. Antony and Cleopatra would flee to Egypt, play out one last tragic act, and die by their own hands the following year. When Octavian entered Alexandria in triumph in August 30th BC, he did so not as first citizen of a republic but as sole master of the Mediterranean world. And it had all come down to 19 small ships, 19 Liburnians that proved once and for all that in war, speed and innovation can shatter the mightiest colossus. But the story of those 19 Liburnians does not end with the smoke clearing over Actium. Their legacy reshaped the Roman navy and by extension the entire empire that was born that afternoon. Within weeks, Agrippa ordered the systematic dismantling of the old Republican fleet. The towering sixes through tens, the lumbering giants that had been the pride of Rome since the First Punic War, were broken up for firewood or converted into merchant hulls. In their place rose hundreds, no thousands, of Liburnians and improved variants. By 25 BC, the standard warship of the imperial navy was no longer the heavy quinquereme but the agile Liburna. Permanent fleets were established at Misenum on the Bay of Naples and at Ravenna on the Adriatic, both crewed largely by freedmen and provincials who could handle the demanding two-level oarage of the new design. The Liburnian Revolution went beyond hulls and oars. It forced Roman tacticians to rethink everything. Boarding actions, for centuries the decisive phase of Mediterranean naval warfare, became secondary. Ramming, precise, scientific, lethal, returned to the forefront for the first time since the days of Phormio and the Peloponnesian War. Training shifted from massed infantry drills on deck to small, highly skilled crews who could execute complex maneuvers at a moment's notice. The harpax itself evolved into the standard corvus of the imperial age, a weapon so effective that it would still be in use 4 centuries later when Belisarius recaptured Africa with a handful of Liburnian-style dromons. Octavian, now styling himself Augustus, understood symbolism as well as strategy. In 29 BC, when he celebrated his triple triumph in Rome, the climax of the procession was not captured standards or chained barbarian kings. It was a single bronze ram torn from Antony's wrecked flagship, carried on a furculum through the streets while the crowd roared. Behind it marched the 19 captains of the decisive squadron, each granted the corona navalis, the rarest decoration in Roman history. Cast in gold and shaped like a warship's prow. Their names are lost to us, but Augustus had them engraved on the victory monument he erected at Actium, a hillside terrace where the beaks of 35 captured warships were displayed in a massive stone wall that still stands today. 10 of those bronze rams belong to the heaviest Egyptian and Antonian vessels. The other 25 are lighter, sharper, unmistakably Liburnian. The site itself became sacred. Augustus founded the city of Nicopolis, Victory City, across the strait, endowed it with games every 4 years to rival Olympia, and built a sanctuary where the 19 Liburnians' original rams were said to have been dedicated to Neptune and Mars. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the new imperial fleet staged mock combats in the Gulf using only Liburnians, reenacting the moment when speed defeated size. And speed became the new Roman virtue. The empire Augustus forged was held together not by heavy legions alone, but by a web of fast communications. Roads, yes, but also sea lanes patrolled by Liburnians that could cross from Italy to Greece in 3 days, from Alexandria to Rome in under a week. When rebellion flared in Illyricum in 6 AD, it was Liburnians that carried Tiberius's reinforcements up the Dalmatian coast so quickly that the revolt collapsed before it could spread. When Germanic tribes massacred 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, the news reached Rome in only 12 days, carried by a chain of Liburnian couriers racing along the coast. For 400 years, the Liburnian and its descendants policed the Mediterranean, turning what had been a Roman lake into a Roman pond. Piracy, which had plagued the Republic for generations, virtually disappeared within a decade of Actium. Grain fleets from Egypt and Africa sailed unmolested, their escorts a pair of sleek Liburnians whose very silhouette struck terror into would-be raiders. In the end, those 19 small ships did more than win a battle. They ended an era of aristocratic competition and civil war, and they inaugurated an age in which one man's vision, enforced by speed, discipline, and innovation, could hold together a world stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The Republic had died in fire and blood on the water that day, but from its ashes rose something greater, something that would endure long after the names of Antony and Cleopatra had become mere footnotes in poetry. And it all began with 19 Liburnians, 19 forgotten warships crewed by men whose courage and precision changed history in the span of a single afternoon. Stand today on the ruins of Augustus's victory monument at Actium, where the sockets for those 35 bronze rams still gape in the weathered stone, and you can almost hear the oars. The wind that decided the fate of the world still blows from the northwest across the strait, the same wind that filled the sails of Agrippa's Liburnians and turned 19 small hulls into the pivot of history. Speed had triumphed over size. Discipline had triumphed over spectacle. One cold-minded young man and his brilliant admiral had triumphed over the last heroes of the old Republic. In 3 hours, the Roman Republic ceased to exist, not with a vote in the Senate or a dagger in the Forum, but with the crunch of bronze against cedar, the screams of drowning marines, and the sight of purple sails fleeing south toward Egypt and oblivion. Everything that followed, the Pax Romana, the imperial fleets, the 4 centuries of relative peace that allowed art, law, and civilization to spread from Hadrian's Wall to the Red Sea, rested on the splintered timbers that drifted ashore at Actium on the evening of September 2nd, 31st BC. Never again would Rome trust its fate to towering leviathans crewed by thousands. From that day forward, the Mediterranean belonged to fast, low, lethal ships crewed by professionals who understood that wars are won by maneuver, not by mass, by precision, not by pomp. And somewhere beneath the quiet waters of the Ambracian Gulf, among the wine jars and broken anchors that archaeologists still pull up every summer, lie the shattered ribs of Antony's giants, and if Neptune has been kind, perhaps the bronze trident ram of one of those 19 Liburnians. They have no epitaph but this: in the time it takes the sun to travel from noon to mid-afternoon, 19 small ships rowed by free men ended a republic and made an empire, and the world was never the same again.